What happens when a dream home becomes a battleground for prejudice and justice? For the Daniels family, what started as a joyful move to a quiet suburban neighborhood quickly spiraled into a clash they never expected. And when their housewarming BBQ is shut down in a shocking turn of events, it's the arrival of the police that flips the entire situation on its head. But why did their neighbor call 911? And how did it all backfire in a way no one saw coming? Stick around to see how this story unfolds. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had a neighbor who made life difficult. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more gripping stories like this one. Your support means the world to us. The sun shone brightly over the serene streets of Cedar Grove, a picturesque suburban neighborhood known for its tree-lined avenues, well-manicured lawns, and charming brick homes with white picket fences. It was the kind of place where people waved from their porches, and kids played on cul-de-sacs until the streetlights came on. But like many places that seem perfect on the surface, Cedar Grove harbored its secrets, and not everyone was as welcoming as they seemed. For the Daniels family, however, Cedar Grove represented a fresh start. Derek Daniels, a tall, confident man with a warm smile, had just accepted a senior position at a prestigious law firm. His wife, Camille, was a teacher whose patience and kindness made her beloved by students and colleagues alike. Their two children, 12-year-old Alyssa and 7-year-old Jordan, were bundles of excitement, eager to explore their new home. The Daniels had worked tirelessly to make this move a reality. Their new home, a spacious two-story house with a wide front porch and a backyard perfect for family gatherings, felt like a dream come true. As they pulled into the driveway on their first day, Derek turned to Camille and said, "We finally made it." Camille smiled, squeezing his hand. "We sure did. This is going to be amazing." Alyssa and Jordan were already racing toward the front door, eager to claim their rooms. The family's laughter filled the crisp morning air as they unloaded boxes, brimming with anticipation for the life they were about to build. But as the Daniels family settled in, a pair of sharp, watchful eyes observed them from across the street. Mrs. Ethel Whitaker had lived in Cedar Grove for over 4 decades. At 75, she was sharp-tongued, fiercely protective of her neighborhood, and deeply resistant to change. Her perfectly styled silver hair and pressed slacks projected an image of respectability, but behind her polite smiles lay deeply ingrained prejudices. To Mrs. Whitaker, Cedar Grove was not just a neighborhood, it was a way of life, one that she believed newcomers like the Daniels family threatened. Standing at her window with her yapping chihuahua, Snickers, by her side, Mrs. Whitaker watched as the Daniels carried furniture into their home. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Another family that doesn't belong," she muttered to herself. "Just what this neighborhood needs." She turned away from the window, shaking her head as if the mere sight of them was an affront to her sense of order. The first encounter between Mrs. Whitaker and the Daniels came a few days later. Camille was planting flowers in the front yard when Mrs. Whitaker, walking Snickers, paused at the edge of the driveway. Her gaze scanned Camille from head to toe, and though she wore a tight-lipped smile, the disapproval in her eyes was unmistakable. "Good morning," Camille greeted cheerfully, brushing dirt off her hands. "You must be one of our neighbors. I'm Camille Daniels." Mrs. Whitaker nodded stiffly. "Ethel Whitaker," she said. "I've lived here for 43 years." Her tone carried an air of authority, as though her tenure in the neighborhood gave her the right to pass judgment on newcomers. "It's lovely to meet you," Camille said, undeterred. "We're so excited to be here. Everyone we've met so far has been so welcoming." Mrs. Whitaker's lips curved into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, well," she said, glancing at the flowers Camille was planting. "I hope those take. The soil here can be unpredictable." Camille's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Thank you for the tip. I'll keep that in mind." Mrs. Whitaker didn't respond. She gave a curt nod and continued walking, Snickers barking at Camille as they passed. Camille watched her go, a faint unease settling over her. There had been something in Mrs. Whitaker's tone, a subtle but clear message. You don't belong here. Over the next few weeks, the Daniels family threw themselves into making their house a home. Derek spent weekends assembling furniture and hanging photos, while Camille transformed the backyard into a haven for family gatherings. Alyssa and Jordan explored the neighborhood, riding their bikes down the quiet streets and making friends at the local park. But not all their neighbors were as enthusiastic as the children they met at the park. While some greeted the Daniels warmly, others offered only polite nods and brisk conversations. The subtle tension was hard to ignore. Derek noticed how some neighbors avoided eye contact when he waved from the driveway. Camille picked up on the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she approached. And then there was Mrs. Whitaker, who continued to observe them with a cold, hawk-like intensity. She never failed to offer a passive-aggressive comment during her daily walks. "Your children are so lively," she remarked one day, her tone laced with disapproval. Another time she said, "I hope your lawn care habits are up to Cedar Grove standards." Camille would always respond politely, but Derek could tell the interactions bothered her. "She's just set in her ways," he reassured her one evening as they sat on the porch. "People like her don't like change, but she'll come around eventually." "I hope so," Camille said, though doubt lingered in her voice. "I just want the kids to feel comfortable here." Unwilling to let the unease dampen their spirits, Derek and Camille decided to take a proactive approach to meet their neighbors. "Let's host a housewarming BBQ," Camille suggested one evening. "It'll be a good way to get to know everyone." Derek agreed. "Great idea. Nothing brings people together like good food." Over the next few days, the Daniels began planning the event. Camille designed colorful invitations, Alyssa and Jordan helped decorate, and Derek made a list of dishes that would appeal to everyone, from classic BBQ staples to vegetarian options. On the morning of the BBQ, the family worked together to set up tables and chairs in the backyard. Camille arranged a buffet of food, while Derek fired up the grill. Alyssa and Jordan hung string lights along the fence, adding a festive touch to the atmosphere. But as they prepared for what they hoped would be a joyful day, Mrs. Whitaker sat in her living room, glaring out the window. To her, the sight of the Daniels' cheerful preparations was a slap in the face, a sign that her beloved Cedar Grove was changing in ways she could no longer control. Her resentment boiled over, and as the first guests began to arrive, Mrs. Whitaker made a decision that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. From the moment the Daniels family arrived on Cedar Grove, Mrs. Whitaker felt an unsettling shift in the air. Sitting in her perfectly arranged living room, she stared out the window at the Daniels house. Everything about them irritated her. Their laughter that carried across the street, the cheerful decorations Camille hung on their porch, even the sight of Derek mowing his lawn in the evenings. To most people it would have seemed normal, but to Mrs. Whitaker it was an unwelcome reminder that things in her neighborhood were changing, and not for the better. Cedar Grove had been her home for over 40 years. When she and her late husband Harold first moved in, it was a place of traditional values, or so she liked to say. Everyone knew their place, and everything was orderly. Over the years, she had taken it upon herself to maintain those standards, positioning herself as the self-appointed gatekeeper of Cedar Grove. To Mrs. Whitaker, It was her duty to ensure the neighborhood stayed as she believed it should be, a bastion of respectability and sameness. Her disapproval of the Daniels was not just rooted in their arrival, but in what they represented. It wasn't just their laughter or their housewarming wreath on the door. It was the way they carried themselves, as though they belonged, as though they had a right to be here. That was what gnawed at Mrs. Whitaker the most, the audacity of it all. As the days passed, her frustration grew. Every time she walked Snickers past the Daniels house, she noticed something else that irked her. Alyssa playing loud pop music in the driveway, Jordan's bike left leaning against a tree, or Camille chatting warmly with passing neighbors. Even the way Derek waved at everyone, too familiar, too casual for her liking, bothered her. Mrs. Whitaker wasn't one to let these feelings fester without action. She picked up the phone, her manicured nails tapping against the receiver as she dialed the number of her closest ally, Helen Simmons. Helen had lived in Cedar Grove almost as long as Mrs. Whitaker, and the two often bonded over their shared nostalgia for the good old days. "Helen, it's Ethel," Mrs. Whitaker began, her voice measured but dripping with disdain. "Have you seen the new family on Birchwood Lane, the ones who moved into the Andersons' old house?" "I have," Helen replied cautiously. "They seem fine, I guess." Mrs. Whitaker let out a sharp breath. "Fine?" "Helen, they're already changing the feel of the neighborhood. Did you see the lawn decorations? It looks like a carnival over there. And their children, always so noisy. Honestly, it's not what Cedar Grove is about." Helen hesitated. "Well, I suppose things have changed a bit lately, but maybe it's not so bad. They seem like a nice family." Mrs. Whitaker's lips tightened. Helen's ambivalence annoyed her, but she pressed on. "Nice families can still bring trouble, Helen. We've seen it before. Remember the Parkers on Elm Street? Things started small with them, too. And then suddenly, property values were dropping and the neighborhood wasn't the same. I don't want Cedar Grove going down that path." The Parkers, of course, had been nothing more than a slightly unconventional family who had moved away years ago, but Mrs. Whitaker wielded the memory like a weapon. She had a knack for painting ordinary events as cautionary tales, feeding the unease of her neighbors and shaping their perceptions to align with hers. By the time Mrs. Whitaker hung up the phone, she had sown just enough doubt to plant a seed in Helen's mind. But Helen was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Mrs. Whitaker made similar calls to other longtime residents. She didn't outright attack the Daniels. She knew better than to appear openly hostile, but her words were carefully chosen to stir unease. "I just worry about how things might change," she said to one neighbor. "We've worked so hard to keep Cedar Grove a certain way. I hope everyone understands the importance of maintaining that." "It's not about them personally," she said to another, her tone feigning concern. "It's about the principle of the thing. Once you start letting go of standards, it's a slippery slope." The responses varied. Some neighbors shared Mrs. Whitaker's unease, but were too polite to admit it outright. Others dismissed her concerns, chalking them up to her usual rigidity. Still, the whispers began to spread, and Mrs. Whitaker took satisfaction in knowing she was laying the groundwork for her next move. Her tipping point came when she overheard Camille inviting neighbors to a housewarming BBQ. She had been trimming her rose bushes when Camille walked by with a stack of colorful invitations, her face glowing with excitement. "We're hosting a little get-together this Saturday," Camille said cheerfully to a neighbor. "Just a casual BBQ to get to know everyone better. We'd love for you to stop by." Mrs. Whitaker felt her stomach churn. A BBQ? A public spectacle in her quiet, orderly neighborhood? She couldn't bear the thought of it, the noise, the crowds, the intrusion on what she considered her sanctuary. As soon as Camille walked away, Mrs. Whitaker marched back into her house, slamming the door behind her. She stood in her kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her mind racing. To her, this wasn't just about the Daniels hosting a BBQ. It was about their audacity to act as though they belonged, as though they could waltz into Cedar Grove and change the very fabric of the community. This BBQ was a line she couldn't let them cross. But what could she do? Confronting them directly would make her look unreasonable. She needed a way to shut it down without exposing herself. That was when the idea struck her. The police. A noise complaint. Some vague mention of suspicious activity. It would be enough to disrupt their event without drawing suspicion. After all, who could blame her for being concerned about the peace and safety of the neighborhood? Mrs. Whitaker's lips curled into a satisfied smile as she began to rehearse what she would say when she made the call. It had to sound just right. Concerned but not accusatory. Vague enough to warrant a response, but specific enough to create doubt. The days leading up to the BBQ passed in a haze of anticipation for Mrs. Whitaker. Each evening, she sat at her window watching the Daniels prepare for their event. She saw Derek stringing lights in the backyard, Camille setting up tables, and the children laughing as they tested the inflatable pool. The sight filled her with a simmering rage. "This is Cedar Grove," she muttered under her breath. "Not some free-for-all." When the morning of the BBQ arrived, Mrs. Whitaker positioned herself by the window with her phone at the ready. She watched as neighbors began to arrive, some carrying dishes to share, others greeting Derek and Camille warmly. The sound of laughter and music drifted across the street, grating on her nerves. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone. This wasn't just about the Daniels, she told herself. This was about preserving the neighborhood. Her neighborhood. Dialing the familiar 3 digits, Mrs. Whitaker prepared to set her plan into motion, confident that by the end of the day she would remind the Daniels exactly who held the reins in Cedar Grove. The day of the Daniels' housewarming BBQ arrived with perfect weather. The sun shone brightly in a cloudless sky, casting a golden glow over the Daniels' neatly trimmed lawn and colorful string lights that dangled from their backyard fence. The scent of freshly grilled burgers and sizzling hot dogs wafted through the air, mingling with the laughter of children playing tag and the cheerful chatter of neighbors arriving with dishes to share. Camille had worked tirelessly to prepare for the event. The buffet table was a feast for the eyes, laden with BBQ classics like ribs, coleslaw, and cornbread, alongside vegetarian options for the more health-conscious guests. Derek stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers and ribs, his smile widening every time a neighbor complimented the setup. Alyssa and Jordan darted between guests, offering drinks and helping the younger kids with games like beanbag toss and hula hoops. "Thanks so much for coming." Camille greeted a young couple with a toddler in tow. "Please make yourselves at home. Drinks are by the patio." The couple smiled warmly. "This is wonderful," the woman said. "You've done a great job organizing this." Camille beamed, her heart swelling with pride. This was exactly what she had envisioned. A chance to connect with the community, to show they were just like anyone else. She wanted her children to grow up feeling like they belonged here, not just as residents, but as part of something bigger. So far, the BBQ was shaping up to be a success. However, not everyone in the neighborhood had chosen to attend. Some had declined the invitation with polite but non-committal excuses. "Oh, we'd love to, but we're busy that day," or maybe next time. Others hadn't responded at all, leaving Camille to wonder if Mrs. Whitaker's whispered words had planted seeds of doubt. Speaking of Mrs. Whitaker, she was nowhere to be seen, but Camille had a sneaking suspicion she was watching. She wasn't wrong. From behind her lace curtains, Mrs. Whitaker glared at the scene unfolding across the street. She had watched the preparations all morning with growing irritation. Now, as more guests arrived and the sound of music and laughter carried over to her house, her annoyance bubbled into anger. How dare they? She muttered to herself, pacing her living room, turning this quiet neighborhood into a carnival. She occasionally peeked out the window, her sharp eyes tracking every movement in the Daniels' backyard. Children splashed in the inflatable pool, their squeals of delight piercing the serene air. Adults gathered in small groups, chatting and laughing as they nibbled on hors d'oeuvres. It was a picture of joy and togetherness, and Mrs. Whitaker hated every second of it. "This is exactly what I feared," she fumed, gripping the edge of her curtain. "If they think they can come in here and take over, they've got another thing coming." Across the street, Camille chatted with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, who had brought a homemade peach cobbler. "This is lovely," Mrs. Wilson said, her kind eyes crinkling with warmth. "I wish more people had come. It's a shame some folks can't see past their own noses." Camille smiled, but the comment stung. She knew exactly who Mrs. Wilson was referring to, though she refused to let it ruin her day. "I'm just grateful for everyone who did come," Camille replied. "It means a lot to us." As the afternoon wore on, the BBQ continued to thrive. Derek shared stories with a few neighbors about his work as an attorney, earning nods of admiration. Alyssa and Jordan played freeze tag with the neighborhood kids, their laughter infectious. Camille felt a flicker of hope that despite the undercurrents of tension, they could carve out a place for themselves in Cedar Grove. But Mrs. Whitaker had other plans. Every laugh, every clink of glasses, every burst of music grated on her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. To her, the Daniels' BBQ wasn't just a harmless gathering. It was an affront, a direct challenge to the way things had always been. Her irritation morphed into a twisted sense of duty. If no one else would stop this disruption, she would. Mrs. Whitaker marched to her phone, her movements quick and determined. Picking up the receiver, she dialed 911 with trembling fingers. As the line connected, she took a deep breath, preparing to deliver her carefully crafted complaint. 911, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked in a calm, professional tone. "Yes, hello," Mrs. Whitaker began, her voice quivering with feigned concern. "I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a very loud party happening across the street from me. It's been going on for hours and the noise is unbearable." The dispatcher asked for details, and Mrs. Whitaker leaned into her performance. "It's not just the noise," she added in a hushed tone. "There's some suspicious behavior going on. I've seen people coming and going, and it's just not normal for our neighborhood. I'm worried something illegal might be happening." The dispatcher's tone remained neutral, but Mrs. Whitaker could sense she had struck the right chord. "Can you provide the address?" the dispatcher asked. Mrs. Whitaker rattled off the Daniels address, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. "Please send someone soon," she added. "I'm just so concerned for the safety of our community." When the call ended, Mrs. Whitaker sank into her chair, her heart racing with anticipation. She could already picture it: the police arriving, shutting down the BBQ and sending a clear message that the Daniels didn't belong. It would be the beginning of the end for their unwelcome presence in Cedar Grove. Across the street, completely unaware of what was about to happen, Camille and Derek clinked their glasses together, smiling as their guests continued to enjoy the warm summer day. The Daniels had no idea that their dream of unity was about to face its first real test. Back at her window, Mrs. Whitaker peered out once more, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a police car turning onto Birchwood Lane. Her pulse quickened, a twisted sense of triumph washing over her. "This will show them," she muttered, clutching the edge of her curtain. "This will show everyone." The festive mood in the Daniels' backyard was in full swing when the distant sound of a car engine drew Camille's attention. She looked up from the buffet table, her smile fading slightly as she spotted the familiar flash of blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of nearby houses. The unmistakable hum of a police cruiser idling on the street grew louder, and the laughter and chatter of the BBQ began to falter. Guests turned to look, some exchanging uneasy glances. Derek, standing by the grill with a pair of tongs in hand, followed their gaze, his brows furrowing in confusion. Camille moved closer to him, instinctively seeking his steady presence as two uniformed officers stepped out of the car and began making their way toward the backyard. The children, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, continued their game of freeze tag until Alyssa stopped mid-run, tugging on her little brother Jordan's arm. "Look, police," she whispered, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Derek handed the tongs to a neighbor and wiped his hands on a towel. "Stay with the kids," he said to Camille, his voice low but calm. He gave her a reassuring nod before walking toward the officers, his posture tall and composed, though his chest felt tight. He had spent years practicing how to remain calm in moments like this, but it was different when it happened in his own home, in front of his family and friends. The officers, one older with a graying mustache and the other younger and visibly uneasy, scanned the backyard as they approached. Their expressions were neutral, but carried the air of someone arriving to address a problem. Derek stepped forward to meet them, his voice steady and polite. "Good afternoon, officers. Can I help you?" The older officer glanced at his notepad before responding. "We received a call about a noise disturbance and reports of suspicious activity." His tone was professional, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes as he took in the scene. A cheerful gathering with neighbors chatting, children playing, and the unmistakable smell of BBQ wafting through the air. Derek raised an eyebrow, folding his arms casually. "I see," he said, keeping his tone measured. "Well, as you can see, we're hosting a housewarming BBQ for some of our neighbors. Nothing more, nothing less." The younger officer cleared his throat, his gaze landing on Derek. Recognition flashed across his face. "Mr. Daniels?" he asked, his voice softer now. "The attorney from Prescott and Gold?" Derek gave a small nod, offering a polite smile. "That's right. I wasn't aware my job had anything to do with a neighborhood BBQ, though." The older officer's expression shifted slightly, a hint of discomfort crossing his features. "We, didn't know this was your residence," he admitted. "We're just following up on a report." "Of course," Derek replied evenly, gesturing to the backyard. "Feel free to look around. I assure you, everything is perfectly above board." Camille approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on Derek's arm. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a flicker of worry. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice steady. Derek gave her a reassuring nod before turning back to the officers. "My wife, Camille," he said, introducing her with a slight smile. Camille offered a polite greeting, though the tension in the air was palpable. The older officer nodded awkwardly. "It seems like a misunderstanding," he said, glancing around the backyard again. He could see the curious stares from the guests, the children huddled near the patio, and the delicious spread on the buffet table. Nothing about the scene matched the vague accusations they'd been given over the phone. Still, they performed a cursory inspection, walking through the backyard with Derek following at a respectful distance. The younger officer stopped near the grill, his nose twitching at the smell of the ribs. "Looks like you've got quite the setup here," he said, attempting a casual tone. Derek chuckled softly. "We're just trying to be good neighbors. You're welcome to grab a plate if you're hungry." The officer cracked a small smile, but the older one gave him a sharp glance, and he quickly straightened up. After a few more moments of observation, the officers regrouped near the patio where Derek and Camille stood. "Everything looks fine here," the older officer said, his tone apologetic now. "Sorry for the disturbance." "Not at all," Derek replied, his voice calm but firm. "We understand you're just doing your job, but perhaps next time, whoever called might consider addressing their concerns with us directly before involving the police." The older officer nodded, clearly aware of the implication. "We'll note that," he said before tipping his hat slightly. "Have a good day, Mr. and Mrs. Daniels." As the officers made their way back to their cruiser, the guests slowly began to relax, though the earlier carefree atmosphere was tinged with a shadow of discomfort. Camille knelt down to Alyssa and Jordan, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. "Mommy, why were the police here?" Jordan asked, his small voice filled with worry. Camille smoothed his hair gently. "Someone made a mistake, sweetheart. Everything's fine now, okay? There's nothing to worry about." Alyssa, more perceptive than her younger brother, frowned. "But why would someone call the police on us? We're not doing anything wrong." Camille glanced at Derek, who crouched down beside her. "Sometimes people don't understand things," he said gently, choosing his words carefully. "And when they don't understand, they make bad decisions. But the important thing is that we're all safe and nothing bad happened." Alyssa nodded slowly, though the uncertainty lingered in her eyes. Camille gave them both a warm smile. "Now, why don't you go play? Everything's okay." As the children returned to their game, Camille stood and leaned into Derek. "Do you think it was her?" she whispered, not needing to say Mrs. Whitaker's name aloud. Derek sighed, his jaw tightening. "Who else?" he replied softly, glancing toward the house across the street. Behind her lace curtains, Mrs. Whitaker watched the scene with growing frustration. From her vantage point, she could see the police walking away, their body language relaxed and nonchalant. There had been no confrontation, no chaos, no dramatic shutdown of the BBQ like she had envisioned. Instead, the Daniels remained standing, their composure intact, their guests slowly returning to their conversations. Mrs. Whitaker's hands clenched into fists as she stepped away from the window. "Useless," she muttered under her breath. "They didn't even do their jobs." Her sense of control, once so ironclad, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She had expected the police to send a message, to remind the Daniels that they were outsiders who didn't belong. Instead, they had left the family unscathed, and the BBQ continued, albeit with a slightly more subdued atmosphere. In the Daniels' backyard, Camille and Derek shared a quiet moment near the grill. "We're not going to let this ruin the day," Derek said firmly, placing a hand on Camille's shoulder. "This is our home, and no one's going to take that away from us." Camille nodded, her resolve hardening. "Absolutely. We belong here just as much as anyone else." The two of them turned back to their guests, determined to salvage the celebration. Despite the disruption, the Daniels' BBQ continued, a testament to their strength and unity. But even as they laughed and mingled with their neighbors, the shadow of Mrs. Whitaker's actions lingered in the back of their minds, a reminder that their fight for acceptance was far from over. The day after the BBQ, the Daniels family sat together in the living room, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. While they had done their best to maintain a sense of normalcy and continue the celebration, the visit from the police still weighed heavily on their minds. Derek sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful but firm. Camille sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, searching for resources on handling situations like the one they'd just experienced. Alyssa and Jordan played quietly in the corner, the weight of the previous day's events still lingering in their young minds. "I think we need to address this," Camille said finally, breaking the silence. "We can't just let it go. If someone's willing to call the police over a harmless BBQ, what's next?" Derek nodded, setting his mug down. "You're right. Whoever made that call, and I think we know who it was, needs to understand there are consequences for that kind of behavior. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous." Alyssa looked up from her sketchbook, her brow furrowed. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" she asked softly. Derek moved to her side, crouching down to meet her gaze. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. But sometimes when people make mistakes, we have to stand up and make sure they don't do it again. That's what we're going to do." Camille stood and grabbed her laptop. "Let's start by filing a formal complaint," she suggested. "That 911 call was a false report, and it's not okay. I'll draft something and submit it to the police department." Together, Derek and Camille crafted a detailed account of the events, emphasizing the disruption the call had caused and the potential danger it posed. Derek included his professional insight as an attorney, pointing out the misuse of emergency resources and the harm it could bring to their family and the community. They submitted the complaint later that day, confident that their voices would be heard. The following morning, Derek received a call from Officer Jenkins, one of the officers who had responded to the BBQ. Jenkins's voice was calm, but carried an air of genuine concern. "Mr. Daniels, I've reviewed your complaint, and I want you to know I take this very seriously," Jenkins said. "I remember your family from yesterday, and I could see right away that the situation didn't add up. I'd like to look into this further." Derek felt a surge of relief. "Thank you, Officer Jenkins. We appreciate you taking the time to investigate." "Of course," Jenkins replied. "I've worked in this community for years, and I've seen situations like this before. They're not always as innocent as they seem. If it's all right with you, I'll keep you updated as I dig deeper." Over the next few days, Jenkins conducted a quiet investigation, reviewing records and speaking with colleagues. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. Mrs. Whitaker's name came up more than once, attached to several similar complaints over the years. Noise disturbances, suspicious activity, and other vague reports, all targeting new families in the neighborhood. Jenkins frowned as he pieced the information together, his growing frustration mirrored by a sense of duty to address the issue. Meanwhile, word about the BBQ incident spread through Cedar Grove, sparking a mix of reactions from the neighbors. Some were outraged on behalf of the Daniels family, expressing their support and condemning the actions of whoever made the call. Others, influenced by Mrs. Whitaker's earlier whispers, remained quiet, their opinions clouded by doubt and prejudice. Mrs. Whitaker, however, couldn't ignore the shift in the atmosphere. Her phone calls with her closest allies grew shorter, their tones hesitant. Neighbors she had once gossiped with now avoided her gaze during their morning walks. Even Helen Simmons, her most loyal confidant, had begun to distance herself, murmuring vague excuses whenever Mrs. Whitaker invited her over for tea. At first, Mrs. Whitaker dismissed the changes as minor inconveniences, but as the days went on, the isolation became impossible to ignore. Snickers barked at the empty sidewalk as Mrs. Whitaker stood at her window, watching her once cozy world slowly unravel. Across the street, the Daniels family took comfort in the growing support they received. Mrs. Wilson stopped by with a basket of muffins, her kind eyes filled with encouragement. "Don't let this get you down," she said firmly. "You're a wonderful family, and anyone with half a brain can see that." Camille smiled, her spirits lifting. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. That means more than you know." Even some of the neighbors who had initially stayed away from the BBQ began to reach out, their guilt evident as they offered belated welcomes and tentative invitations to coffee or playdates. Derek and Camille welcomed each gesture, determined to foster the sense of community they had always envisioned. But amidst the support, there were moments of tension. The whispers about Mrs. Whitaker grew louder, and while many neighbors sympathized with the Daniels, others hesitated to confront the longtime resident directly. Camille overheard snippets of conversations during her walks, words like overreacted and unfair, but also phrases like typical Ethel and not the first time. For Mrs. Whitaker, the sense of control she had once wielded so confidently was slipping away. The isolation gnawed at her, but her stubborn pride wouldn't allow her to admit fault. Instead, she doubled down, retreating further into her bitterness and nursing her grievances like old wounds. One evening, Derek received another call from Officer Jenkins. His tone was serious but determined. "Mr. Daniels, I've uncovered something that I think you should know," Jenkins began. "It seems that Mrs. Whitaker has a history of making these kinds of complaints, always targeting new families, always vague and exaggerated. This isn't the first time she's caused trouble." Derek's grip tightened on the phone. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happens now?" Jenkins hesitated before answering. "I'll be speaking with my supervisor about the next steps. False reports like this can have serious consequences, and Mrs. Whitaker needs to understand that, but I wanted to let you know first." As Derek hung up the phone, a mix of emotions churned within him. Relief that the truth was coming to light, anger at the harm Mrs. Whitaker had caused, and determination to protect his family from further prejudice. Camille sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "What did he say?" she asked softly. Derek took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "It's worse than we thought. She's done this before, to other families. Officer Jenkins is taking it to his supervisor." Camille's eyes widened, her shock quickly giving way to resolve. "Good," she said firmly. "It's about time someone held her accountable." Derek nodded, his jaw set. "This isn't just about us anymore. If she's done this before, she'll do it again. We have to see this through." As the Daniels prepared for what lay ahead, Mrs. Whitaker sat alone in her dimly lit living room, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Her sense of control, once so absolute, was beginning to crumble, and for the first time, cracks were forming in the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for decades. The days following Officer Jenkins' investigation brought mixed emotions for the Daniels family. While they were relieved that their formal complaint had been taken seriously, the ripples of the incident continued to spread throughout the neighborhood. Conversations were no longer casual greetings about the weather or weekend plans. There was an underlying tension, a divide among the residents that simmered just beneath the surface. Some neighbors openly rallied behind the Daniels family, voicing their support in gestures both big and small. Mrs. Wilson, who had attended the BBQ and brought her famous peach cobbler, was particularly vocal. She made a point of speaking positively about the Daniels whenever the opportunity arose, hoping to counteract the negativity that Mrs. Whitaker had sown. "I've lived here for 30 years," she told a group of neighbors one morning during her walk, "and I can tell you the Daniels are one of the best families to move into this neighborhood. It's about time we showed them their welcome." A few others nodded in agreement, but some shifted uncomfortably, reluctant to take a side. Others still avoided the topic altogether, fearing that speaking out would create waves they weren't prepared to deal with. Mrs. Whitaker's influence, though waning, was not completely gone. Her allies, while fewer than before, were still vocal in their disdain for the Daniels. At home, the Daniels did their best to push forward, refusing to let the hostility define their experience in Cedar Grove. "We're not going anywhere," Derek reminded his family one evening as they sat around the dinner table. "This is our home, and we're going to show them that we belong here." Camille nodded in agreement, though the strain was evident in her eyes. The incident with the police had left a mark, particularly on the children. Alyssa, normally outgoing and bubbly, had become quieter at school, hesitant to invite new friends over. Jordan, too young to fully understand the complexities of the situation, often asked his parents questions that broke their hearts. "Why don't some of the neighbors like us?" he asked one evening while helping Camille bake cookies. "We didn't do anything wrong." Camille paused, the weight of the question pressing heavily on her. She crouched down to his level, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Sometimes, people don't understand things that are different from what they're used to," she explained gently. "But that doesn't mean we stop being kind. We show them who we are by how we treat others." Jordan nodded slowly, though the confusion lingered in his young eyes. Camille hugged him tightly, wishing she could shield both her children from the harsh realities of prejudice. Despite the challenges, the family resolved to take another step toward fostering inclusivity in the neighborhood. Camille suggested hosting a second event, something smaller and more casual, but with the same intention of bringing people together. "Maybe a community coffee morning," she proposed. "Something where people can just drop by, have a cup of coffee, and chat." Derek agreed, and the family set about planning the event. Camille prepared an assortment of baked goods, while Alyssa designed simple invitations that they distributed door to door. "We'll see who shows up," Derek said, his optimism tempered by realism. The morning of the event arrived, and the Daniels' home was filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm muffins. Camille arranged a small buffet on the dining table, while Derek greeted the first few arrivals. Mrs. Wilson came, of course, along with a handful of other supportive neighbors. They chatted warmly, sipping coffee and complimenting Camille's baking. But for every neighbor who showed up, there were several who didn't. Camille noticed some residents walking their dogs or working in their yards, deliberately avoiding eye contact as they passed the Daniels' house. It stung, but she reminded herself that change wouldn't happen overnight. The tension wasn't lost on Alyssa, who stood in the corner of the room, observing the scene with a mix of hope and disappointment. "Why don't more people want to come?" she whispered to Camille when the room momentarily quieted. Camille placed a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Some people need more time to see the good in others," she said. "But every little step counts, and the people who are here, they're the ones who matter." Meanwhile, across the street, Mrs. Whitaker was fuming. The sight of neighbors entering the Daniels' home, even in smaller numbers than the BBQ, felt like a betrayal. She paced her living room, Snickers yapping at her feet as she muttered to herself. "They're trying to take over," she hissed. "If we don't stop them now, they'll ruin everything." Unable to let it go, Mrs. Whitaker picked up the phone and began dialing. This time, it wasn't the police she called, but her closest remaining allies. Helen Simmons, though growing increasingly wary of Mrs. Whitaker's intensity, reluctantly agreed to meet. So did a handful of other longtime residents who still valued Mrs. Whitaker's opinions, even if they didn't fully agree with her methods. The group gathered in Mrs. Whitaker's living room later that evening. She laid out her grievances in a voice thick with indignation. "They're trying to change everything about this neighborhood," she said, her tone sharp. "It starts with a BBQ, then a coffee morning. What's next? We've worked too hard to let this happen." Helen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Ethel, I'm not sure it's as bad as you think," she ventured cautiously. "The Daniels seem like good people. Maybe we should give them a chance." Mrs. Whitaker's expression hardened. "A chance to what? Turn this neighborhood into something unrecognizable? No, Helen, we have to draw the line now." The meeting ended with no clear resolution, the group dispersing with murmurs of unease. For the first time, even Mrs. Whitaker's staunchest supporters began to question whether her crusade was worth it. Her relentless negativity, once a uniting force for like-minded residents, was now driving them away. Back at the Daniels house, the coffee morning wound down, and Camille and Derek stood side by side reflecting on the day. It wasn't a big crowd, Camille admitted, but the ones who came, those connections mean something. Derek nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's a start," he said, "and we'll keep building from here." As the family cleared the dishes and tidied up, a faint sense of hope lingered. But across the street, Mrs. Whitaker sat alone in her dimly lit living room, staring at the empty sidewalk. For the first time, she felt the sting of isolation, not just from the Daniels, but from the community she had once controlled so effortlessly. Her allies were dwindling, her influence fading, and though she wouldn't admit it, a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered a truth she couldn't ignore. The neighborhood was changing, and she was being left behind. A week after, Officer Jenkins began his investigation into Mrs. Whitaker's history of false complaints. He decided it was time to confront her directly. With a folder of evidence in hand, Jenkins pulled up to Mrs. Whitaker's house. Her neatly trimmed hedges and pristine lawn a stark contrast to the chaos brewing behind closed doors. He had been an officer long enough to recognize a pattern, and Mrs. Whitaker's actions over the years had painted a clear picture. A woman desperate to maintain control, no matter the cost. Mrs. Whitaker answered the door, her expression guarded as she saw Jenkins on her doorstep. "Officer," she said curtly, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here?" Jenkins wasted no time, his tone firm but professional. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm here to discuss the recent complaint you made about the Daniels family. After reviewing the details, it's become clear that the call was unfounded, and it's not the first time you've made similar reports." Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed, her composure cracking for the first time. "I was only doing what I thought was right," she stammered. "They were disrupting the peace. I've lived here for over 40 years, Officer Jenkins. I know what's best for this neighborhood." Jenkins set the folder on her coffee table, flipping it open to reveal a list of past complaints. "Mrs. Whitaker, this isn't about maintaining peace. These complaints, targeting new families, making vague accusations of suspicious behavior, show a clear pattern, and it needs to stop." Mrs. Whitaker's hands clenched tightly around the armrest of her chair. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "This neighborhood, it used to be different. People knew each other. There was order, respect. Families like the Daniels don't—" She caught herself, her words trailing off. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, his expression unwavering. "Families like the Daniels don't what, Mrs. Whitaker? Belong? Fit your idea of what Cedar Grove should be?" For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint ticking of a nearby clock. Mrs. Whitaker's shoulders sagged as she struggled to find her words. "This place was my sanctuary," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "When my husband was alive, we worked so hard to make it what it was, and now it's all slipping away. I just wanted to hold on to what little I have left." Jenkins softened slightly, recognizing the kernel of truth in her admission, but his duty remained clear. "I understand that change can be difficult," he said, But filing false reports to harass your neighbors isn't the answer. It's not only unfair, it's illegal. If this behavior continues, there will be legal consequences. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. For years, she had operated with impunity, confident that her reputation and standing in the community would shield her from scrutiny. Now, she was realizing how fragile that facade had become. Meanwhile, across the street, the Daniels family received an unexpected visitor. A neighbor who had initially kept their distance, Mr. Ramirez, knocked on their door, a hesitant but determined expression on his face. Derek answered, surprised to see him. "Mr. Ramirez," Derek greeted. "Good to see you. What can I do for you?" Mr. Ramirez cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I just wanted to stop by and apologize," he began. "I wasn't at the BBQ and I've been quiet about everything that's been going on, but I've been watching. And I realize now that staying silent was the wrong thing to do." Derek stepped aside to let him in, nodding as he listened. "It takes courage to admit that," he said, "and it means a lot to hear you say it." Mr. Ramirez sat down with Derek and Camille, sharing his perspective. "I've lived here for 10 years, and I've seen Mrs. Whitaker pull this kind of thing before. I always thought, well, it's not my problem. But it is. What she's doing isn't just wrong. It's tearing this community apart. I want you to know you're not alone. I'll stand with you." The conversation brought a renewed sense of hope to the Daniels family. With each act of support, no matter how small, they felt their resolve strengthen. Camille smiled as she walked Mr. Ramirez to the door. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "It means the world to us." Later that evening, Jenkins returned to the Daniels house, updating them on his confrontation with Mrs. Whitaker. "I've made it clear that her actions won't be tolerated," he told them. "But I think this is bigger than just one person. The community needs to come together and address this head-on." Derek agreed. It's time for the neighborhood to decide what kind of place it wants to be. Camille suggested holding a community meeting, a chance for residents to voice their concerns and find a path forward. "If nothing else," she said, "it'll force people to confront the truth." Word of the meeting spread quickly, and on a crisp Saturday afternoon, the Daniels opened their home to host it. Neighbors arrived in small groups, filling the living room with an air of anticipation. Mrs. Whitaker, to the surprise of many, showed up as well, her expression unreadable as she took a seat near the back. Derek stood at the front of the room, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming. We've had a challenging few weeks, but we believe this is an opportunity to move forward as a community." He recounted the events surrounding the BBQ and the police visit, careful to remain factual and composed. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Mrs. Wilson spoke up. "What happened to the Daniels wasn't just wrong, it was shameful," she said firmly. "If we want this neighborhood to thrive, we need to stand up against behavior that divides us." Others chimed in, echoing her sentiments. But the tension in the room peaked when Mrs. Whitaker, her face pale but determined, rose to speak. I only wanted to protect the neighborhood," she began, her voice wavering. "I never meant for things to go this far." Camille stood, her voice calm but resolute. "Mrs. Whitaker, this neighborhood isn't just yours to protect. It belongs to all of us, and if we're going to move forward, it has to start with understanding and respect." The room fell silent, all eyes on Mrs. Whitaker as she absorbed Camille's words. For the first time, the weight of her actions seemed to fully sink in. She sank back into her chair, her head bowed as the whispers of her neighbors swirled around her. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of unity among many residents, But Mrs. Whitaker left quietly, her once unshakable confidence shattered. For the Daniels, the day marked a turning point. Not just for their family, but for Cedar Grove as a whole. The cracks in Mrs. Whitaker's control were now too deep to repair, and the neighborhood was beginning to embrace a future shaped not by exclusion, but by inclusion. The weeks following the community meeting marked a dramatic shift in Cedar Grove. Mrs. Whitaker, once the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of the neighborhood, found herself increasingly isolated. Her usual allies no longer answered her calls or invited her over for tea. Her morning walks with Snickers, once a time for exchanging pleasantries with neighbors, became lonely treks past houses where blinds were suddenly drawn and doors remained closed. The realization hit her one afternoon when she stopped by Helen Simmons' house, hoping for a sympathetic ear. Helen greeted her at the door, but her smile was thin, her tone brisk. "Ethel, I'm busy today," she said, avoiding eye contact. "Maybe another time." As the door closed, Mrs. Whitaker stood on the porch, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had spent years cultivating an image of respectability and influence, but now that image was shattered. For the first time, she felt the sting of rejection she had so readily inflicted on others. Across the street, the Daniels family was experiencing a very different reality. The aftermath of the meeting had brought an outpouring of support from neighbors who were eager to make amends. Small acts of kindness began to fill their days, plates of cookies left on their porch, handwritten notes of encouragement, invitations to coffee or playdates. The family, determined to channel their experience into something meaningful, decided to take action. Camille proposed the idea of forming a neighborhood diversity group, a space for residents to celebrate their differences and foster understanding. "If we can turn something painful into something positive," she said, "we'll make Cedar Grove stronger for everyone." Derek agreed, and together they organized the group's first event, a culture day in the local park. The idea was simple yet powerful. A gathering where neighbors could share food, music, and traditions from their respective backgrounds. Flyers went out to every household, inviting everyone to participate. The day of the event arrived, and the park buzzed with activity. Tables were lined with dishes from around the world: spicy curries, homemade tamales, buttery samosas, and more. A small stage was set up for performances, and children raced around laughing and playing games. Camille greeted neighbors as they arrived, her warm smile setting the tone for the day. Derek worked the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with a growing crowd. Alyssa and Jordan, more confident than ever, helped set up games and encouraged other kids to join in. As the afternoon unfolded, the atmosphere was one of unity and joy. Mrs. Wilson, ever supportive, led a group of neighbors in a line dance that had everyone laughing and clapping along. Mr. Ramirez brought his guitar and performed a soulful rendition of a classic folk song, earning enthusiastic applause. Even neighbors who had initially kept their distance showed up, their reservations melting away as they joined in the celebration. The Daniels' resilience and kindness had begun to bridge divides that once seemed insurmountable. Toward the end of the event, Derek stepped onto the small stage, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his tone filled with emotion. "This isn't just a celebration of diversity, it's a celebration of community. Camille and I moved here because we believed Cedar Grove could be a place where our family could thrive. And despite the challenges, today proves that this neighborhood is everything we hoped it could be." Camille joined him, taking the microphone. "We've learned so much through this journey," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "We faced pain and prejudice, but we've also experienced incredible kindness and strength. Today, we're not just neighbors, we're family." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing across the park. Derek and Camille embraced their children, their hearts full as they looked out over the smiling faces of their community. Back on Birchwood Lane, Mrs. Whitaker sat by her window, watching as neighbors returned from the event, their faces lit with excitement. She had received an invitation, but she hadn't gone. Whether it was out of pride, shame, or fear of rejection, even she wasn't sure. But as she sat alone, a flicker of regret sparked within her. For years, she had clung to an image of what Cedar Grove was supposed to be, only to realize too late that her vision had blinded her to the beauty of what it could become. Across the street, the Daniels family gathered on their porch, basking in the warmth of the day's success. Alyssa hugged her mom tightly, her voice filled with gratitude. "Mom, today was amazing. I'm so glad we didn't give up." Jordan chimed in, his excitement bubbling over. "Can we do it again next year, please?" Camille laughed, ruffling his hair. "I think we can make that happen," she said, glancing at Derek, who nodded in agreement. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the family sat together, reflecting on their journey. We've been through a lot," Derek said, his voice thoughtful. "But we've come out stronger. And we've made this neighborhood stronger, too." Camille squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with pride. "This is our home," she said, "and we're exactly where we're supposed to be." The story of the Daniels family in Cedar Grove serves as a powerful reminder of what can happen when people stand up to prejudice and choose unity over division. Their journey wasn't easy, but through resilience, kindness, and determination, they transformed not only their own lives but also the community around them. What about your community? Are there ways you can bring people together, celebrate diversity, and create spaces where everyone feels welcome? Small acts of kindness can lead to big changes, and it starts with each of us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, check out our other videos about inspiring stories of perseverance and change. You won't want to miss them. Together, we can build a brighter, more inclusive world, one community at a time. Thank you for watching.